again, I've been an architect for, 15, 20 years now, done a lot of different work. I think this is one of those projects that is kind of a dream come true, a labor of love to be able to do something that, again, tells a story that needs to be told, affirms the place and affirms just kind of speaking to issues that need to be told. And I think for me personally, it was an honor to actually do the work to put this together and make this all happen.
Awesome.
Sure. So again, I'm with Master Design Group. We are honored to be partnering with Hank Willis Thomas on this project. I think both of our organizations have similar values about social justice and bringing that into the built environment. And what an opportunity this project was to create a memorial in Boston Common to Martin and Coretta, and not just to them, but to their movement and their message. One of the things in working with Hank on this project is I was really inspired by a photograph of Martin and Coretta, and the opportunity to take that picture and almost spatialize it and make it into a sculpture was something that was a driving force that he put together. And then for us to think about, okay, what is the scale of that? What is the materiality of it? How does it meet the ground and create a place that really feels like it's both part of the Boston Common, but also speaks its own voice and speaks a different story. So again, using this photograph, making it into a sculpture, making it so that you can actually inhabit and be it and feel it or embrace, and really understand this call to action, this idea of love, really that being something that wants to be a big catalyst in making the change we want to see in the world.
I see that. So it's her hand.
Yeah, so it's taking a photograph from after Martin was announced that he won the Nobel Prize, and it's this embrace between the two of them, and you can almost see him just sort of like being supported by her and her kind of lifting him up. So just the sort of emotion of that moment, really making that again part of what the sculpture is all about. And again, it's not Martin. It's Martin and Coretta. It's the two of them. It's their love. It's their togetherness that make this happen.
And we so often hear the story of just Martin.
Yeah.
But what about the ways in which the partnership and the connection between the two of them really makes the story much more
Exactly.
grounds his work. It's great.
And even, just quickly moving beyond, it's Martin and Coretta. It's also the city of Boston. It's also the local civil rights heroes from that era that we're memorializing with the plaza as well, trying to honor 64 other members of the sort of Boston community that were part of this March for Justice and doing the work.
I love how it takes the story full circle. Really
Exactly, yeah.
That's what it does.
All right.
I think
What you're looking at here is a mock-up model, and you can sort of see each of these lines represents one of the pieces of the thing that all comes together.
How many
on site.
pieces total are we talking?
I believe it was 7 pieces in total.
7 pieces.
So you can sort of see,
Wow.
GHIBE.
And they're numbered.
Yeah, exactly.
How cool is that?
So again, the amount of coordination and attention to detail and craft to make this all happen is remarkable. Yeah, so again, we've been working on this since about 2018. It's about 4 years to really just begin with the idea, iterate, work through the design, work through the scale, the materiality, the plaza design, and then the construction of it as well. Again, there's nothing like this, so it's kind of a one-of-a-kind thing that again wants to be done right, and we're excited by how it all came together.
Celebrate and create more space for, again, the Black community, and really sort of making spaces of value. I mean, the Roxbury Library was one. It was an old building, didn't have a lot of love. I think we wanted to make the warmth and create something that felt, purposeful. And then here, I think the big excitement here was Boston Common. Again, it's so central to Boston's identity and iconography. The stories we tell reflect who we are and who we value. And so the idea of like putting something to Martin and Coretta and their message on the Boston Common, again, that's just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make that happen. And so, even thinking about the design, you can see here a lot of the stones that we were looking at. We wanted to do something that was similar to the Common, so we're speaking the same language, but it's still different, and it has a unique identity that, again, speaks to these values and speaks to these stories that aren't told. Again, so you got this quilt-like pattern with how the stones come together, which evokes traditions of African-American quilt making. You have this literal trying to make kind of a garment of destiny, similar to King's letter from Birmingham jail. So really trying to embed narratives into the making of this thing beyond just the sculpture, but again, how it grounds itself and makes a place in Boston Common.
And then if you can just come around here, some of these drawings. I'm really fascinated by the process.
Sure.
And so if you can just talk a little bit about the geometry of this and why you chose this geometry.
Yeah. and you can see it. You can see a little bit here too as well. And this is a lot of the inspiration. Again, it's evoking this idea of quilt making, right? Again, that's something that is very prominent in African American folklore, specifically around the era of Underground Railroad. We really just wanted to make a quilt, something that really reflects the craft of how this thing comes together, and again, evoking an association to Dr. King's idea of this garment of destiny. So seeing how the pieces can come together, you can see on the floor here, we were just from the very beginning trying to think through how do we make this come together, what are the colors, what are the finishes of the stone. So we show that it's not about this one thing, but it's about pieces all coming together to make this bigger movement. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so you can see here, like, and again, we work with some amazing craftspeople that are, very skilled and have a lot of love in terms of how they can treat the stone, understand how to make this thing, make a stone feel warm, make a stone almost emote as well. So this was a great project, and Amari got to meet him as well. He came out there, came to Wisconsin, got himself dirty as well.
Yeah, and I think, when King returned for the 1965 Freedom Rally, we talked about that earlier, we wanted all the heroes who were inspired by King, who King inspired and who were the ecosystem of the work both nationally and locally, and Reverend Dr. Michael Haynes was one of them, and so we talked about how do we create a memorial that is beyond this great person memorial, great man memorial, one individual solemn figure who saved the day. And so none of us exist alone. We are in community with each other, and sometimes especially in these days, we just saw maybe 14, 15 votes, a house divided, right? And so how do we rebuild a house? And so we had to be reminded through these stories and these messages, both directly and I think to Jonathan's point, subliminally. And so this memorial attempts to do that.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about that quote right there and what you were talking about, right? None of us exist alone, right? We're all part of this web.
That's a lot of
I love that.
exactly,
It's none of us makes it here alone, and that's the story, especially of Black folks, right? When you mentioned the Underground Railroad,
Yes.
yeah. So just so powerful. I'm grateful to be here to not only just talk to you and to share this with the Hyde Park community, but to really share this with the city of Boston. You have been engaged in a monumentous project of really understanding how we can memorialize a figure who is so important to our history here in Boston, to United States history, and to global history, but to really how do we also democratize this figure who would not have been able to make and do all that he accomplished without being grounded in this theory of love.
Yes.
But also without being surrounded by others who are also dreaming this vision of a beloved community, of bending that moral arc towards justice. And so if you just tell us a little bit about the making of the Embrace, how did this idea start that we here in Boston must pay tribute to this movement, to this man, to this couple who really meant a lot and mean a lot to so many of us?
Yeah. The founder of this initiative, Paul English, had this idea and solicited quickly some co-founders, Reverend Liz Walker, Reverend Jeffrey Brown, Damon, and Dr. Kia Martin, to go on this journey to build a memorial for originally Dr. King. And so, many times I think memorials honor these great men honorees. And so that's how it started. And so there was this national call for proposals, 126 submissions, 5 finalists, and the submission by Hank Willis Thomas and Mass Design Group was unanimously the winner. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you remember, there were voting stations in post offices in some of the BPL libraries.
Nubian Square, a bowling building.
In the bowling building,
yeah.
The City Hall, and people cast their vote. And so the Embrace was the winner, hands down. And so we were excited that not only did we get a remarkable piece of art by a world-renowned artist, but also a local Boston firm, Mass Design Group, that had an international perspective, and their work was international. They did work in Rwanda, they did work in Alabama with the EJI, the National Freedom or National Lynching Memorial down there. And so,
which I encourage everyone to go and really, if you want to really understand the history of this country and really understand the legacy of slavery and lynching and the trajectory of criminal injustice in this country, it is imperative that folks, if they have the means and the ability, to check out the incredible work that's being done down at the Lynching Museum with Brian Stevenson and so many others.
I mean, when I went to that museum, I had to take a walk around the block. It just kind of, I needed to process it by myself. I had gone with a group of people, but I needed some time. And so, the Embrace won, and I think the amazing thing about this memorial of the 5 finalists, this was the only one that included Mrs. King. And so we just said, hey, create a memorial for Dr. King, and Hank and Mass decided to include both of them. And I think what was inspiring about this submission, it was based on a photo of Dr. and Mrs. King hugging the moment that they had won Dr. King had found out he had won the Nobel Prize. And
I like how you said they, though, even though it was him, but that's sort of the story of the Embrace, that it's not one person.
That's right. It's all of us.
Yeah.
And so the first thing he did was hug his wife. And, the photo is like pure joy and love and exhilaration. But Hank talks about the interesting thing about the photo for him was that Mrs. King, when you hug someone, someone's the top hugger, someone's the bottom hugger, that Mrs. King was on the bottom of the hug. And Dr. King's entire body weight was rested on Mrs. King.
So like she was holding him up.
She was holding him up, and it was symbolic to the role of not only Mrs. King, but Black women in general, of holding up movements, holding up people, holding up communities. And so by honoring Mrs. King, we were not only honoring their entire family, but a community of people who were hidden figures. And so I think it was important. And Mrs. King was a hidden figure in plain sight. She was in the photos, she did the work. Dr. King was assassinated in '68, and so you and I know Dr. King's legacy through Mrs. King, because she was around. She was the one stewarding the work. She was the one stewarding his legacy. She was the one that ensured that all 50 states, and it wasn't until 2000 that all 50 states celebrated the holiday that we are now celebrating today. And so she is our voice of Dr. King in our lifetime for you and I. And so I feel excited that we're able to honor both of them through this memorial.
I love that. I love that so much, especially because I think we know of Mrs. Coretta Scott King via Dr. King, but before they even met, she was her own person and her own advocate and her own social justice warrior and her own artist, giving so much of herself to the world. And so some of that gets subsumed in the story of Dr. King, which is obviously one of such depth and importance to us, but she too can stand on her own.
Yeah, she came here to go to New England Conservatory. She was a classically trained singer and was here to fine-tune her craft. And so she had a life. And she and Dr. King came from different backgrounds, and I think many people don't know, particularly outside of Boston, that they met here as college students. And so right now there's roughly 375,000 students that come to Massachusetts to go to a higher education institution, or that are from here that go to a higher education institution. The Kings were a part of that wave in the 50s. And Dr. King had a car. So can you imagine a Black man in the 50s
The
in
green
Boston,
Chevy, right?
with a car. And so he was popular, right? Driving around with his car. But it wasn't safe for him. It wasn't safe for Black folks. And I think what I love about you and our conversation and your leadership is, it wasn't safe for a Black couple to think about staying in Boston. Imagine if they had stayed when they graduated and made Boston the epicenter of the civil rights movement. Imagine what our city would be like. And right now, in BPS or in some company or in one of those higher education institutions, there could be a Dr. and Mrs. King there. And how do folks like you and I make Boston a welcoming, safe city of belonging? And I think that's the opportunity, and I think the Embrace is symbolic of that opportunity.
I love that, and I take that as a call to action. To me, as a city councilor, and the work that we're doing every day is how do we deal with this attrition that we experience when students come here, especially students who look like us, Black and brown, who come to Boston, and we still struggle with that label, which is oftentimes real, about Boston not being welcoming to Black and brown folks, to Black and brown professionals who want to make Boston home. So what is our role and our responsibility to make sure that we have more Black-owned establishments that are able to be welcoming and inclusive and be places where people can be comfortable without having to wear any sort of mask?
Yes.
What is our responsibility to build a place that is fun and dynamic so that when the future Mrs. King and Dr. King go somewhere and meet, they can do so at a place that is fun and that is emblematic of the Boston that we want to create.
And I think the memorial, you know, it was important for us, you know, while Dr. King was here, Mrs. King was here, they spent most of their time in Lower Roxbury and they spent most of their time in Roxbury. And when we built this memorial, it was important for us to build it downtown in Boston Common, in America's oldest public park, in a place that hadn't had a major memorial in the last 60 years, because it was important that we were there and that the memorial being placed in such a historic place in the city that said, as a marker, brown people belong and are part of the ecosystem and the fabric of the city. And the memorial honors, of course, Dr. and Mrs. King, but the plaza sits on 1965 Freedom Rally Plaza, which honors an additional 65 other distinguished Bostonians from the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Which is, again, amazing. It's about democratizing this idea of legacy and who belongs in this story. And it is really all of us, right? It's
That's right.
never just one person. It's all of us.
Yeah, 45% of the folks honored are women. 5 of them identify as Latinx.
Amazing.
4 of them.
Can you give us some of the names? I've been.
You know,
okay, all right.
No,
I was trying to see if it was a secret.
No, some of them we know, right? Some of
Okay.
them we know. It's, you know, Mel King, Hubie Jones,
Yeah.
Melnia Cass, Ruth Batson.
Love it.
You know, some of the icons that we know. Reverend Dr. Haynes, you know, who was a friend of King's,
Yes.
you know, longtime
Yes.
pastor and elected official in Roxbury, 12th Baptist Church. You know, Otto and Muriel Snowden, the storied family who founded Freedom House. And so those are some of the names that are honored there. Clara Bell, Jeep Jones, some icons in the city. And there's also indigenous leaders who are named on the plaza. There's Asian leaders who are named on the plaza. There's 2 folks who identify as Jewish folk leaders who are named on the plaza. You know, one person who identifies as white is the Unitarian minister, Reverend Reed, who was killed by white supremacists during the Freedom Rides, and Dr. King spoke at his funeral. And so these icons in Boston, these unsung heroes, Bob Moses, right, like who's also a national figure, are named and honored. You know, Boston is such a historic place. You know, you and I could leave this building and that's the place that Sam Adams dropped a nickel down a gutter square, right? But for such a city that is so iconic and memorialized with stories of Boston Tea Parties and one by land and 2 by sea, there isn't the scale of memorials and the remembering of people of color in the city that we deserve and that would honor their contributions. And so I think this is the beginning for our city to illuminate the fact that there is more than one story around and about Boston.
Right, they were talking about this embrace that is an embrace between Dr. King and Coretta Scott King, but this embrace is large enough to hold all of us individually and collectively. So I'm just always, the way that this was visualized, the way that this has been executed is really should be a point of pride for every Bostonian, black or white, and should be a point of special pride for Black and brown folks here in the city.
Yes, and I'd say it's centering the Kings and the other leaders. And I think to your point, it is a memorial for all of us. You know, when you and I and others, when you ask people during the height of the real dark days of the pandemic, what they wanted to do, people missed the funerals of their loved ones, they missed the births of family members and friends, they missed important birthdays and holidays and seasons with people they love and cared about. And you ask folks what they wanted to do, if they could be with their family, and people said they wanted to embrace the people that they cared about. And I hope it is a reminder to us all of this time and our survival through this incredibly traumatic experience that we are in this different stage of, but it was traumatic for us. And so the embrace as a symbol of love, hope, belonging, and really care is a symbol for Bostonians and the world to see, but for us to remember this time. And I think we couldn't have chosen a better emblem. The embrace looks like a heart if you look at it from certain angles, and I think this beloved community that King was aspiring for is one that I think we are on the verge of building today.